All right, so now that we've dipped our toes into a complex React feature like custom hooks, we're going to explore an even more advanced feature next. And to do that, we'll illustrate the reason for, or at least one reason, why it's super useful. Let's start by taking a look at this very poorly designed diagram I created that outlines a very simple top-level component hierarchy for our rate mySetup application. What we see here is this app.js component and all the components it renders depending on the URL. And we also see the props that it's currently passing to each component. So just take a second and take a note of anything here that stands out to you, seems important, not important, inefficient, etc. Just take a quick second, think about it. No pressure, nothing important, or nothing too important at least. Okay, so you might have picked up on a few things that I won't touch on, but one you probably recognized is that we're passing certain state all over our application. Pretty much every single component gets access to the user object here. Notice that? Everything. Here, 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 here. All over the place. And in particular, if you look here, this new post form, this post component, has to go through another component to get that user. Literally the only reason this home component needs to accept that user prop is to pass it from home to post and new post form. And you can see that here. If you look at the app.js file, it is passing user, 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 user right here. And this home component accepts the user, and then it doesn't actually do anything with it here other than pass it to more components like this. See that? And then those are the components that actually use that user prop. And so this whole thing of passing prop to one component just to pass it to another one, and especially as this we start to drill down through a number of intermediary components, which we will as our application grows, this is known as prop drilling, and it can be super cumbersome, especially when you have a deeply nested component hierarchy. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a way to make sure every component that wanted access to that user had a way to do it, or maybe even any user-related logic too, and it could do so without us having to pass it down explicitly from the app component to wherever it needs to be? Now, the answer is yes, there is, and it's what we're going to be talking about here. Hint, hint. And if your first thought is why don't we just use a custom hook, like use user or something, or use authenticated user to pass the authenticated user object around everywhere, then that's actually a good thought, but that approach won't quite work. And the reason for it, and if you actually look at the React docs here, it says, does a custom hook get isolated state? And it says each call to a hook gets isolated state. So what that means is if we actually look at our two hooks here, this use login form and use registration form, what it means when it says each one gets isolated state is if they were sharing the same state, then they would share this email username, password, and password confirm form. They would both be using the same form, but that's actually not the case. They use a different form. Every call to this use login or to this use authentication form hook provides a fresh version of this. That's what it means by isolated state. So every single function or every single custom hook that's used here gets a fresh version of whatever's inside it. And so when we call this here, so if we actually if we log out and we go to our login and then we go to sign in here, if we type in something in the email there and then go to login, it's not there also, which just means that these two things don't actually share state, they just share logic. So this form is a fresh form for the use login form hook, and it's a fresh form for the use registration form hook, even though they call the exact same hook. Every call to a hook gets its own fresh state. So we actually need a different way to handle passing around shared global state, because we want everyone to get access to the same user object, just like we're doing here. Because everyone gets access to this user object is the same thing. And we just take this same user object once the user authenticates, and we pass it all over our application. So how do we do that? Well, React helps us out. They provide a way to avoid the need to pass shared state all over the place like we're doing here. And they named the system React Context. And according to the docs, Context is designed to share data that is considered global, which is exactly what we're doing here in this application, in this app component, is it allows you to share a global state for a tree of React components. And it's primarily used when some data needs to be accessible by many components at different nesting levels, just like we see here. Now, again, this isn't even like that crazy, but this is exactly like, if this were like, maybe there are like 3 more components rendered by post or new post form, then it would be an even more strong use case for context. But in this case, it'll be good to at least illustrate how to use it, because you will need it more often than not to do things, in particular like authentication. So we're gonna cover context in depth. Now, again, I want to say that context is not a simple concept, and there's a decent amount to know about it. So what we're covering here is just like an approach to using context that I found to be effective. There are some caveats to what I'm doing here that I'm glossing over some of like the nitty-gritty details. So if like you're already familiar with this stuff, just know that this is not a perfect example, but it is one that works, and it's definitely a way to do it, and it's a good way to make our code like concise, reliable, and useful. And so in the next video, we're going to start building out context objects and passing them around our application.